out the AMA had sort of gotten onto this agenda. And that's why we're seeing kids in the classroom and why that's so important, to give them an opportunity for movement. What we're also seeing is this tremendous pressure on what's happening to our bodies as we sit for long periods of time. So I love this sort of graphic image. It's done from some research done by Esther Gokhale. She created a great book called 8 Ways to a Pain-Free Back. And what she did is actually look at Gray's Anatomy. And no, that's not a TV show. That's actually a medical text. And that Gray's Anatomy from 1911 and compared that to the human spine from 1990. And look at the differences. What do you spy with your ergo eye, the differences in those two spines? Well, goodness gracious, one is shorter than the other, and that's the most current spine, and it's more curved. And so what we know is that curve puts extra load on our spine. Well, this is a real indication why kids, and actually some of the work done, Dr. Alan Hedge at Cornell has actually found that there's a preponderance of kids who graduate high school already with back issues. And I would have to believe that a big portion of that is from inactivity and prolonged sitting. So Mott Children's Hospital actually at the University of Michigan, and truth be told, I am a Michigan grad, and I actually live in Ann Arbor, so I hope I didn't offend any people who don't like Big Blue, but we actually did a study that said, what percentage of kids do you think do not get enough exercise? And we'll look at our youngest population, those 5 through 10, those most active kids. Would you be surprised to find out that 3 out of 4 kids do not get enough exercise? That's really important because when we look at what's happening today, there is a direct correlation with sort of exercise and movement and proper blood flow with diabetes. When I was born, the risk of me developing diabetes in my lifetime was 1 in 4,000. A child born today, that risk is 1 in 4. That's shocking. And most of that, 95% of those diabetes cases are what we know is now type 2 diabetes. They used to call it adult onset diabetes, but now there are documented cases of kids as young as 5 years of age with type 2 diabetes. And so what we really want to make sure is we look at this health issue and understand, how does the health issue relate to my physical workspace, to my classroom, to my learning commons, to my library? What does that mean in terms of academic performance? And what is the gap? So there was really a preponderance of evidence out there from National Health and Human Services survey called NHANES that looked at what the obesity epidemic looks like. And for kids in particular, the simple solution from Wang, Orleans, and Gortmeyer suggests that 41 kilocalories a day, and let's not be complicated here, a kilocalorie is just the energy I expend. For all sakes and considerations, a calorie is a kilocalorie. A calorie in a food that you might consume, and a kilocalorie is about the same. So what can I do to change this sort of issue? 41 kcals a day of energy expenditure is enough to flip the scales, no pun intended, the other way. And for adults, for teachers, it's more kcals per day. Let's take a quick snapshot, and that's really important. 41 kcals a day seems like it's doable. I'm going to take you through the last 30 years. What you're seeing is time lapse of every state in the union as we go from 1990 to 2000, all the way to 2014. And this is on a loop, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I live in the state of Michigan. I showed you that. It's the Mitten State. And on the bottom right, there is the number that represents how many, about 7% of the population in 1990 that was overweight, not overweight, sorry, obese. By the turn of the century, it was 21.4%. And when the last NHANES data, since this data came out in 2014, nearly 1 in 3 of the population in the state of Michigan are flat out obese. So the solution to this might be, eat less, exercise more. And I know a lot of teachers and administrators that I talk to have healthy choice options for food, and we're seeing that a lot. But unfortunately, a lot of what's happening is kids are eating more, and we're seeing PE and exercise happening less. They're not having the time to do it. They're not doing it. To investigate this problem, I went and sought out some of the most knowledgeable people in the world. And one of them I found down in Texas. His name is Dr. Mark Hamilton. And he talked to me a little bit about what happens when we sit and how we don't engage our big muscles in our legs and we don't get blood flow. And then he went off and talked about all these lipoproteins. And I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hold on, Mark. I'm an engineer. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. I'm the hick from Red Creek here. Tell it to me like I can understand it. He said, okay, Josh, when you give people food? I'm like, yeah. He said, understand that your body responds whether you're active or inactive. He said, did you ever play the game Pac-Man? I said, yeah, I love that game Pac-Man. Well, when you're moving around, you're like Pac-Man or Mrs. Pac-Man, would be neutral here, eating those little dots, waka, 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 waka. And when you stop moving, your whole body out. I said, can you show me some way to look at this? He said, sure. And I don't believe in gory slides, but he actually showed me a test tube of plasma from a subject who ate the same meal, one being active and the same person being inactive, and you can see the difference. The cloudy, fat-filled test tube is that of the inactive person, and the one where it's waka, 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 eating all those little fat cells is something that's done by low intensity, called it LIPA, or low intensity physical activity. I said, okay, Mark, you got me up off my chair, and if you're not up already, I'm addressing you today from a standing desk, and I'm really feeling active for that. It's not the kind of active movement that causes you to sweat. He said, there's a really neat solution to this. I said, cool, what is it? He said, it's NEAT. NEAT is an acronym. It stands for non-exercise. I like it already. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I said, okay, hold on. That's a big word, thermogenesis. Tell it to me. He said, okay, do you ever remember the story of the Aesop fable of the tortoise and the hare? I said, yeah, that was actually me. I used to bike into my ergonomics consulting firm, sit down in a chair all day, and bike home. I was a couch potato, except I had this little burst of activity, living my life like the hare. I mean, and that's not what we're talking about here. What NEAT is living your life like the tortoise, slow and steady, some small fidgeting, and it's that non-exercise. In fact, my personal story is I went from that active couch potato about 4 or 5 years ago, who was biking into work and sat all day and biked home, who was about 205, 210 pounds, to the person I am today. And if you watch carefully, I'll show you a before and after, because NEAT has been really the key to that. And the NEAT is just that small fidgeting. If you ever know somebody like twirls a pen, or a student that flips a coin, or is tapping their foot, that's all kind of NEAT. It's non-exercise thermogenesis. So your body does either this exercise or this non-exercise activity. 2 centuries ago, the average person generated about 2,000 kcals a day of NEAT. Today's administrator, teacher, or principal that you see listed here generates about 700. So about 2/3 less. Why is that important? Because NEAT, when we're able to build it into the classroom, and I'm quickly going to show you some examples of that, we're going to actually see how that can actually help you. So when Mrs. Chafee, that very prominent figure in my educational background, told me to sit still and concentrate, she might have actually been better served to told me to fidget, because I'll actually focus a little bit better. Dr. Mark Lepore actually and his UCF team basically looked at this with some folks and some kids who were half were ADHD and half without. What they found is both groups used movement to help them focus, but the ADHD group moved a lot and absolutely was essential for them to gain sort of a station. So he basically shared that it's much like a teenager needs movement, just like I need coffee to start my day. So that fidget to focus. And so we see that happening with everything from fidget bars under the base of desks to under the desk surfaces that I can touch and fidget. I actually just finished a product design with a little like anemone fingers underneath the desk that are tactile, to ability to walk around and read. And Dr. Roland Rutz basically has trademarked this or registered that whole fidget to focus, because it can be any senses. It can be tactile. It can be all kinds of things. It's what we call a modulation of a dysregulated system. And it really does allow sustained focus and allow kids to get into that zone with persistent use. So I encourage you to think about that. And if you haven't ever picked up a text by Fidget to Focus, it's a great book. So there are some ways to do it. Let's talk about, okay, Josh, let's talk about how do we do it? Well, just the simple things. Like if I have no budget, we can actually find that putting our fidgeters up front, preferential seating, getting them up front, using layouts. And I'm going to talk about this important concept of pods or neighborhoods. I don't know how many folks are out there have used sort of fidget tools, whether it's a bumpy cushion or, Rubik's Cubes. But now you can see some of the kids reading here. They're reading their cards using wobble boards, active seats, and we'll show you some examples of that, standing desks. The whole idea of makerspace and learning commons are part of that as well. So there's a really nice change that's happening out there in the world that really identifies, and I think learning commons or the library area is a great place to start. So let's get down to the meat of what we're going to talk about, Josh. What are the 3 lessons? 3 important lessons, and what were those 5 important benefits? Well, here's lesson number 1. How many of you have seen a shift in the way that we're teaching kids, and are you teaching your kids if we have educators out there? So pedagogy is basically the art and science and profession of teaching. As the product of 2 teachers and the sibling of a teacher, I hear a lot about how that's changing. The biggest thing is sort of the active learning model. And so we're seeing that happen where instead of what I call the sage on the stage, it's more the guide by your side. And that's more student participation, more discussion. If there is one acronym I've been hearing a lot about, it's PBL, right? So it's project-based learning, getting kids to work together. Project-based learning means we come together, we break up in small teams, we have all the skills that are needed. In fact, they mirror very much what I see out in industry as well. Project-based learning. So we may have some of the folks on the webcast here today that actually have been to South by Southwest and the EDU conference. Over the course of the last year, we've been working with surveying some of these educators to find out what they feel are the most important elements to succeed in the classroom from a teaching standpoint in the next 5 years. What they said is, Josh, never in the history of education have we seen it change so rapidly. It's blended learning. It's a combination of instructional, project-based learning. It's personalized, and it's differentiated for each student. So I had the unique opportunity to work with the IBM Watson team. That's whole quest is to learn how kids learn before we create a curriculum. It's pretty insightful. As well, being adaptive, individualized, and also flipped so that we can understand that I may have you do work outside the classroom and come back and report on that. There's also this concept about getting kids into, and I'm going to use a term that may be new to you, but it probably is more common than you think. It's called stand biased. A stand biased environment, you've seen now if you go to an airport, you might see some desks are low or some of the tables are low. Some of them are high. If you go to a restaurant, it'll ask you, do you want bistro height or regular height or standard height seating? In a lot of areas, stand biased is much like my kitchen. I stand up and do the dishes. It's a stand biased environment. And that allows students to move between formal and informal, and they're doing that real, and now there's the virtual environment. So there are lots of different ways, and we can see some of those environments. And so active learning, goodness gracious, active learning requires an active workspace. And so that active classroom, and we're going to talk a little bit about that layout, is pretty important. So let's go through some of the elements. So what I basically have learned from you all is that it's project-based and it's group-based. This drives participation, and it gets me, based on this problem-based learning, we've seen this whole evolution of sort of meeting space and flat fab labs and maker spaces. We've seen that carry on to sort of adult education and pathways for a whole student approach. And I think this is why it's really important. So while the active learning, active classroom and project-based learning is great for kids, it also matches what we see out in the adult working environment. And it's part of that whole student approach, because these lessons that they learn, what kids learn in the first few grades and through middle school, carry them throughout their whole life. So that goes from health education to understanding how I actually involve in this whole idea of lifetime learning. And so I really want to tell you that the active classroom, the active learning approach, and the whole student message is really critical to this. So lesson number one, the way we're teaching kids is different today, and so shouldn't form follow function. Lesson number two, we want to prioritize physical changes over technology upgrades. So I think we're probably at the time and get you more active to bring Liz back in and give you another poll question. So Liz, why don't you fire off with your question?
Okay, great. I think our audience is going to have some unique insight into this. If you could select what you think is the average age in years of classroom furniture in the U.S. today, you can see your choices there.
Yep, so we're going to give you 30 seconds or so. So click your button, click, 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 away you go. So the average age of the furniture that's out there. So I recently was engaged for a project as an ergonomist. They asked me to involved in something called Classroom of the Future. And this is a really exciting activity. It involves some of the folks at IBM Watson and some of the other folks that are looked at curriculum development and design. The tri-state area where I was working with this group had identified that they had a budget of about $7 million for multiple schools that they're going to make this change happen. Intriguingly enough, 3/4 of that budget right? Over $6 million was spent on IT. I understand tablets and the speed of my broadcast is important, but you know what? It's really important to have the physical environment. So what are the results here, Liz? Can you take a look?
Let's see. It looks like the majority of our thinks about 21 to 30 years is probably how old the furniture is in their schools.
Okay, so what is the answer? Well, the answer today for the average age of classroom furniture is 48 years of age. 48. So it was new when I was an early adolescent, right? So my goodness. We're seeing states across the country put major initiatives. So I'm going out to California in about 2 weeks to participate in the CASH conference, which is basically facilities designed for the classrooms in the state of California. They just passed in the November election in the state of California, a $9 billion bond to basically upgrade school facilities. So my message to the group out there is let's fight for the adequate hardware to support the new software and the software of our kids over technology. So I think we're missing the full benefit when we don't take that whole thing into account. And so, let's say, Josh, that sounds expensive, and gosh darn it, you're a designer of some of the products that we're seeing, and that's full truth be told, I do make some of those products, but you know what, I've also seen kids be creative. How many of you have had a 3D printer placed inside your school in the last year? I know some schools have actually got a 3D printer and they're using. Well, one high school class group had a project to turn the elementary school kids' desks into standing desks. They 3D printed at a pretty low cost little desk risers that they could place under these 6 desks. For literally a couple of dollars, they made an active classroom. I think the message is that we don't have to break the bank to do this. Well, I'll go back now and take a quick second and say, well, wait a second. We want to change, but does it really matter? Does it matter? What is our South by Southwest team this August? What do the community of the best educators say? So what percent of these educators believe that physical design of the space affects learning, not some of the time, not occasionally, but most of the time? Oh, how much? Most of the time. The answer is about 86%. About 8 or 9 out of 10 of you say, most of the time, the form of my learning space affects my learning quality, attention, engagement, and ultimately performance. So, as a kid growing up, I heard my dad and my mom and now my sister talk as educators, the age old proverb that a teacher on their feet, gosh darn it, it's worth two of them in their seat. And that's never been more true than today. And a lot of things that I'm sharing are good for the teachers as well. Right? So if you raise a desk up, not only does that student get active, the teacher doesn't have to bend over. When we look at what are the important characteristics, the really important characteristics, and this is an infographic again from my South by Southwest EDU community from the summer. The number one thing they said is collaborative. The bigger the word, the more important it is, right? Flexible. So if my lesson plan changes, guess what? My classroom, my learning environment better change. It better be comfortable, right? It's better be simple and some of those other items. And when we do it right, it can actually transform what wasn't occupied as often as we'd like, library holding a huge amount of books, into a gathering space before classes begin, during the day when teachers could take certain areas as you look inside one of those learning commons that allow the student voice and student choice to choose where and how they work. And I think libraries and learning commons, as I call them, are a really great place to start. So there's an interesting study that Dr. Chuck Hillman did, and he basically looked at your brain, and that's the brain on the top left. The blue and the green is low flow, and that's basically not a lot of blood flow. On the right, you see the reds and the yellows. That's more blood flow. After a 20-minute walk, significant more blood flow occurred on the individual student. So it's more than just fixing our back, and it's more energy, and it actually transmits more of the good things like serotonin, which helps us also sleep at night, dopamine, which is that feel-good hormone, and oxytocin, which is the kind of emotional thing we get when we get a hug. So if we can actually move and generate some of those positive feelings in the classroom, it might actually make a positive impact. All right, 2 down, 1 to go. Lesson number 3. So I don't mean to alarm you, but we actually have to build in some new layouts, and these require a little bit more space if we're going to be flexible. And so what you see is a layout on the left-hand side here of what I call swim lanes around. Instead of our desks up against the wall, we actually create swim lanes in a perimeter that exists around so the teacher can be a guide at my side and swim through specific project-based learning areas. We might have storage, but we might have writable walls. We might have a centrally located or at least a positioned teacher station. And so we might either bring those kids together in pods and desks in different shapes. The whole idea is that this increased space, and it gives me, again, if I want to work seated, I can. There might be an opportunity to work standing. This is all on wheels. It might have a combination of soft seating, stackable seating, or no seating. And so the whole idea of the power of choice is this move towards stand-biased desks. There might be some different types of seating. I'm going to go through 3 kinds. There's the wobble seat, and we'll give you an example of that. Ball chairs, and then more flexible seating that moves with me. The idea of lap desks that I can take over with me, fidget bars on the base of desks, and even the wobble boards that kids use. So here's an example of some of the different seating. So on the bottom, you see some of the wobble stools. They actually fidget and move their whole body around. They actually create that, what we call it, a neat. So it is truly a neat seat. Some of the ball chairs allow me to take ownership for my posture. And when we put those inside learning commons, we might actually have a stand-bias table with a nice little rack for some of my wobble boards. And so if I want to do some reading, I can choose the posture that I prefer. And so it's really exciting to see these things. And I don't like the term library, as much as I think today it is known as a learning commons. And so, or scholars commons or digital commons. It's sort of like similar to a library, but it's more like a Starbucks. It allows for remote or online education. It's great for collaboration, meetings. Teachers are using the different space, and And they're really exciting because they tend to be centrally located in most of your schools. We can repurpose some of the space by digitizing some of the written literature. I'm not saying get rid of all of it, but we can actually provide a combination of different learning environments and give kids choices, right? And this is student voice, student choice. Well, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation looked at some of this, and they actually found that, you know what, there are some positive benefits for motion and movement. So in their case, test scores went up and discipline referrals went down, and there was less of this bullying that occurs, and it was more organized. So less school nurse visits, and more importantly, you know, that diabetes data I shared with you is just shocking, you know, from 1 in 4,000 to 1 in 4. And so, you know, we all are, you know, very much focused on how our schools grade out and what our kids' performances are, but health and safety and wellness is it's a critical part of this. I'll give you some other knowledge about this. So what you see here is the power of movement. So it's not just enough to move, but it matters when I move. So after you eat is the best time. So here you can see point 0 is the point in which you consume food, and immediately your glucose levels skyrocket afterwards. If you are active in that first hour after you eat, you can cut your glucose levels in half. See, I learned this from my Bronx Nana. I say her name. She was 93 in a brownstone in New York City. And you know what? I say her name and I smell ravioli. It's amazing. I just say Bronx Nana. But you know what she taught me? After we ate, we walked in the neighborhood. We took a walk after we eat. Well, the data is absolutely clear that 1 hour after you eat is essential time to get kids active and engaging. And that's really important because they won't suffer the crash that occurs on the red line that you see later. So I just want to share with you, it's important to move, but also timing matters. And so let's think about getting some of those stand-up activities and getting kids engaged right after or right first thing in the morning after they've had breakfast. And then we can do that in this concept called a neighborhood. And so a neighborhood's a key element. It's a technology which allows me to mobile learning and desks. We could actually put them together in podiums and give little work pods. And Elton Hills did this with Mayo Clinic, and they actually looked at some of the different areas. So I can choose to work in my zone that fits me. Again, student choice, student voice, student choice. And so this is all part of sort of the evolution of the way we're teaching kids and the way the kids are learning. I want to take a moment, and I'm an engineer, I am a science guy, I am a geek, to share with you what's happening in terms of the field of science. So, you know, as a 30-year practicing ergonomist for 25 years, I sat in that chair all day and thought the goal of ergonomics is to make you all so comfortable you never moved. Yikes, that comes with some unintended consequences. And so today, you know, I didn't know what I didn't know at that point, but today I know better. And I want to share with you some of that data in terms of what that relates to. What we know is that kids spend an inordinate amount of time sitting down. This is part of that lifetime learning that they carry through them to their jobs and their lives, and it's directly related to poor health later in life. You know, I know when I went to school, it was rote memorization, trying to have desk after desk, and I know I was so excited when I went off to my day at school. I was a guy with a lot of motivation, but I would come home and not have the same energy. I don't know, you know, inactivity plays a role in that. And so, you know, when you have a kid who's getting ready to go for school, and I know there's any number of things that can happen, a lot of things that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found, whether it's bullying or I don't feel so good, I didn't feel engaged. But how do we flip the script on this and make that so I come home more energized and actually take that through lifetime learning? I think that's really important. That's what these activity permissive, and again, we're permitting kids to learn in different ways. So instead of saying sit down, sit still, and sit in this hard plastic chair that was designed with a desk so my janitorial staff can clean underneath it, we're going to give them options. And one of the options is a completely new way of sitting. And we're not asking to send kids in space. Why in the world are you showing an astronaut? Because this shows you how the human body, what it positions in the absence of gravity. You'll notice there's an open hip position. Knees are slightly bent. Arms are slightly raised. A very neutral. This is what your body's neutral position is in gravity. Kind of like Josh, me, riding a Harley with highway pegs, right? And what we're seeing is a line of seating, like the fidget seats and some of the different wobble stools and perch or semi-standing seating become available. Well, it pains me to say this as a Michigan man, but some of the best research is coming out of the Ohio State University. And Dr. Bill Maris at the Spine Research Institute looked at what are the effects of sitting versus this middle posture of semi-standing or perching, and also full standing. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but what he did find is that over the course of an hour, my body goes less and less and less. And I call this my Goldilocks and Three Little Bears slide. So this porridge is too cold. There's not enough activity. The CI stands for co-activation of my muscles. It really isn't important, but it just means activity is going down. Over on the far right is standing. This porridge is too hot. Kids move and move and move, and adults move and move and move until they create something called discomfort-induced movement. This porridge is just right, and that's the perching or leaning where my body moves and relaxes and moves and relaxes and allows me to do that neat fidgeting in a sustainable fashion. This is a critical finding because this came out last year, and this is part of what we're calling the self-regulated learning space. So Greg Manega, a Canadian teacher, talked about giving kids the ability to wiggle, giving them options, giving them choices. Movement is the key, whether it's a wobble stool or the little portable stool you can see that actually telescopes out, and I can actually take that outside. So whether it's a stick seat that you see on the right, or any of the other types of seating that goes with a traditional desk. Hey, some of these movements are a little, some are a lot, some are a tremendous amount. So we do know that kids want to move, and I did mention that they should move after they eat. I also mentioned, I get asked the question, well, should I stand all day or should I sit all day? Listen, you shouldn't do anything all day. If you only remember one thing from this webinar, is that the best posture, the absolute best one, is always your next one. And so if I can switch up 20 minutes of sitting or leaning or perching with 2 minutes of movement followed by 8 minutes of standing, that's a half hour. If I break that 30 minutes into 22 and 8, and take that over a course of a day, that's a couple hours of standing, about 45 minutes of movement, and still a whole bunch of sitting. We can get kids options. They can actually be more engaged. They might actually be some no-cost options like this classroom in Malaysia, which they basically